So my question to you is, and I guess we're going to get it straight right on
Sure.
camera, but I heard your dad was a bit of a showboat. And I don't know if that was the cause of that or
I
not.
don't. Well,
so we want the truth
I
here.
think what happened to him there is when he came out of the hole, everything was fine, and the front end was up just a little bit. And he always, it was hometown pole, so that was, you've heard where you're adding alcohol to the water injection.
Right.
He put in a little extra. And of course, he always ran road gear, but the front end was up just a little bit. Still narrow front, and
Yes.
at about 75 feet, it started dragging him left. Well, I think he was turning the wheel.
Okay.
And I don't think he realized. And it touched and straightened out a little bit, but then it kept going left, and then it touched the second time, rolled him over.
Okay.
And he was lucky to get off. I got a picture that was in the paper where he's on the ground getting up, but yeah, it was crazy.
Breaking barriers.
My name is Gary Bontrager. I want to welcome you to another episode of Breaking Barriers podcast. I'm very excited for today's guest. It's somebody I've gotten to know through tractor pulling, but even the folklore or the history of his dad pulling in the Eastern Iowa community is something that's preceded him, and he got to experience from a young child growing up. We're going to be talking about some things that hopefully pique your interest, and if you have anything to comment on that, please respond to the comments in this video. Let us know. We would like to visit with you. Mark Hamm here is my guest, and he would like to hear from some of you as well. Sure. So just interact with us. Let us know if you have some answers to some of the questions, or maybe you even have your perspective of the story and your parent or somebody was a part of that. We just appreciate your input, and thank you for watching Breaking Barriers podcast. What's most interesting is, for some reason, it didn't connect with me that Doug was your father, and anybody in the sport years ago, especially that was in the Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri area, would have known Doug Hamm.
Yep.
Seems like almost every time I do a podcast, Doug's name comes up. So the thing that I also, that this podcast is about the history of the sport. But one thing that's so different than it is today, all those guys were building parts themselves.
Sure.
And so they were helping each other probably a lot more than what we do today.
Right.
It's a lot more proprietary information.
Right.
Because, if I build something and it works, we're not telling anybody until they figure that out.
Yep.
So those are some of the differences. So tell me a little bit about what your first earliest memories were of your dad's tractor pulling. Mm-hmm. And then we want to get into the progression as you got maybe older and more involved in some of the stories that follow that.
Sure. I remember a lot as a kid, clear back to probably early 70s. He started in the late 60s, but I remember going to pulls when I was young, little, and I went all the time if I could. And a lot of times him and I'd go by ourselves, but he started with an Oliver tractor in about 67, 68, a 1650 that he ran just local, drive to the pole type of stuff. And a funny story, he went to a pull over in Wyoming, Iowa, and he wanted to go because it was an ITPA pull and he'd never run that. And he got out there and he was first puller and he hooked on the skid. And, with an Oliver, you got your under and direct and over. And he took off, he said, and shifted it up, and about 75 feet, he had to already shift down, and about 100 feet, he shifted down again, and it killed him. And the skid guy came up, and he asked him if he was going to keep it or go again, and he said, there's got to be something wrong with this skid because I only went 100 feet. And he goes, I don't know what you got for a tractor, but he said, I promise you there'll be 6 or 7 of them that go out the end. And he's like, you don't know what you're talking about. So he hooked on again, and same thing happened. 100 foot, he was done, and he went to the end and watched, and sure enough, 6 or 7 went out the end, and that was when he knew he needed to build something better. Right. And he built the 4010 in 72, I think. So, yep.
So that was, the Oliver was a farm stock straight off the farm.
Yeah. I don't even know if it had a turbo. I couldn't tell you. Yeah.
Probably not if it was that.
Yep.
So when he built the 4010, is that the tractor he ran the entire time?
Yep.
Okay.
From like 72 to 81. When he bought it, when they started, it was a tractor that had gone through a barn fire. Okay. And all they had was the rear end and I don't know, maybe the bell housing or something. Right. That's all that was left. And so they bought it, put it together, and it was him and another guy. And they pulled together for a year, but it didn't work really good because he found that he was doing all the work and the other guy would just show up to drive. And so Dad bought it, and then he started running on his own in 73. Right. Yep.
And so at that point in time, he was still building a motor, running one turbo.
Yep.
And it was starting to advance off of the stock side of it because those would have been non-turbo tractors.
Sure.
When did he name it?
He had the Oliver actually named Smog Frog in the 60s. So I don't know where that came from. He just said green tractor, smoke, whatever.
Right.
And that's where that came from. And it just kind of stuck. And I always thought it was a catchy name. And he had a little logo, which we can show you later. And so he named that clear back in the 60s.
And we're sitting in front of your truck.
Yep.
And of course, you've got a little tribute.
On the
right
front.
On the very front of it right there. So that's really cool to have.
Well, and I put the frog on the side of my truck too, just as a tribute to
him. So when he started in the early 70s with the 4010 then, that's when basically ITPA and NTPA were really in the beginning stages.
Sure.
I mean, it was, late 60s when that was forming?
Yep.
He was involved with some of that as well, wasn't he?
He was actually at most of those banquets and rules meetings because just like anything else, they wanted a set of rules instead of one place you go here and one, And he was out there with John Klug and all those guys, and I don't know how much input he had at that time, but he did go to those meetings, and that was a big deal to get those one set of rules.
Right.
Yep.
Well, up to that point, and I know I had another guest that talked about it, but it was what they called a lot of brush pulls.
It was.
And then it was kind of a free-for-all.
Yep.
They tailor it to who was the local
local
hero.
Yep.
Twin turbos, when did that whole thing start?
So I think in 74 is when he started, and he always used to talk about a guy that he saw. His name was Gene Keek out of Wisconsin. He had a Ford, and it had twin turbos, and I think my dad saw that in 73 or maybe at Louisville in 74, early 74. Right. And that's when that started, and that just made a whole difference in the world. But the hardest thing was getting them to run because nobody done it, or very few had done it. And this is a true story. He'd pull it on Saturday or whatever, and then the next day or Monday we'd be going to truck shops and Caterpillar and anywhere to try to find another turbo that might run better because they didn't know what size intake wheel they needed or exhaust housing or anything. And to get that combination to work was really hard. Then you also had to cool it down, and he was running 2 intercoolers at the time, which is all they had. I mean, it was factory John Deere stuff. And
but you're talking John Deere factory intercoolers.
Yeah, like
none
one
of
off
this stuff today.
No.
Have today.
And I think I got a picture where there's one on top of another.
Okay.
And he didn't get to water injection until probably 75 or 6.
Okay.
But that end of 74, he really finally got it going, and then 75 he won the Iowa Tractor Pullers Points Championship because he kind of had the bugs out of it.
Right. What age were you at that point?
I would have been about 5 or 6 because I was born in 69. Yep.
So tell me, you got any stories of crazy stuff you can remember that happened at that age yet?
All the time. One thing that sticks out is we went to some pull up in, I don't know, we were up in central Iowa, wherever the Boondocks truck stop was up in there.
Right.
I think it was in Stan Burton's hometown, and I just remember a bunch of us were staying in a motel, which they did back then. You didn't have a hauler, and there was we'd gone to the pull, and we went back to the motel, and everybody ate, and I went, he sent me to the room, and I remember waking up at 2 a.m, and they're all in the pool and jumping around and drunk and drinking beer and having fun. And a lot of those guys, I don't want to name names, but when they got out of town, they liked going to see the strippers and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's some guys that of that they wanted to go, that's what they wanted to do. And they always had a good time. They were always together, drinking beer, having fun, telling stories, joking around.
Right.
Yeah, good guys.
Well, and it seems like it was quite a fraternity that kind of traveled together like a circus back in those days.
Like 10, 12 in a row. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it seems like there was different groups depending on what area of the state they were in.
Sure.
And they worked back together a lot.
Yep.
So the intercoolers, though, at that point were just cooled based off of a radiator.
They actually he had a place to put ice.
He did.
So we had to haul ice. Like the last stop before you got to the pole was the gas station to buy 20 pounds of ice because he ran 2 classes. And I was remembering that because we had a camper on the back of the truck, and then the bumper hitch trailer.
Right.
And that stuff would lay back there. Well, by the end of the night, it all melted, and it turns to mud because you're walking over. But you had to have enough to run the 7 and the 9. The funny thing about that ice is you'd pack that. He'd always say I'd put 10 pounds of ice or whatever it was in there. And when he'd be done with his pass, he'd let that water out, and it would be warm enough to wash your hands. It ran through there that fast. Yeah.
And that was just off factory intercoolers.
That didn't flow very good, and maybe that's why.
That could be part of it.
Yep.
They well, I guess that was, I didn't know when they started doing the intercooler, but at that point, what kind of pump were you running?
He was already to an inline pump, and that is kind of a neat story because he actually got the print from John Deere. John Deere would help the pullers some back then in the early 70s, and they gave you like a cutout where you'd put it on the block, and you'd have to cut that out to mount that pump on the right-hand side of the motor. And him and another guy did that in the shop, and it's just a matter of marking it out and start drilling that cast and getting it out knocked out of there. And I think when he went to the two turbos, he had to have an inline pump because I don't think the Rosenmaster would have run.
No.
Yeah.
I think, and that was kind of that pump, I mean, it was okay for a farm tractor, but it definitely was choking them down.
Sure.
I mean, they switched that pretty quick. So to know what the progress was of all these changes, was it purely feel? You guys didn't dyno at that point. I'm sure the PTO was gone, and you were getting past the horsepower that PTO dyno
way
was
over.
was going to handle.
Yeah, there was no way to test anything. I mean, it was all guesswork. They didn't know. You know, they used to talk about what kind of horsepower they might have, but it would have had to have been a math equation because you didn't have no way, no way of knowing. Yeah.
I've heard a lot of math equations. I've heard people, tell me that, they were running 3,500 horse.
Sure.
Well, what we know today, they probably
not.
No,
probably
and,
not.
I know Warren Ropp had mentioned that. He goes, no, we didn't have. He said, you're getting more out of a single charger than we were out of all the contraption they were putting together on that.
I kind of believe that, but part of me doesn't know if that's 100% true.
Well, we don't know.
We would never know.
No.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I do know out of a single turbo tractor today is it's a lot more reliable because the technology's been out so long.
Yep.
But I gotta believe. But the other thing is tires were different.
Sure.
Front ends, you can weight them and carry them different. So there was a lot of change in that.
Well, and the skid itself was so much heavier. You could take your little vehicle out here and probably get the skid to move, where back then it was stuck to the ground right out of the bat, off the bat. I would challenge anybody to put on a full lug set of tires, though. Sometimes, I really do. I think there's times they might hook better. I really do, but you're also going to pile a lot of dirt. But I'd love to see somebody.
I don't want to do it with
Travis Slawbaugh, any of you super stock guys, try that one time and just see what happens.
See if they break them off or what happens. So the intercooler and the ice, that happened right away?
I think once for sure, when he put the two turbos on, he had to have a way to cool it down because you burn pistons too much. Air, fire would come out the pipe, and
that was pre-water injection.
Yep. And then he went to water injection. I think all that happened. I think in '76 is when he upped the turbo program. He went to a guy his name was Dana Munson over in Aledo, Illinois. He was a super smart guy. That guy actually, the clutch he designed for his pulling tractor was bought by Case International at the time. And he didn't even realize what he was doing when they showed up to buy one, and then they put it in all their tractors.
Really?
Because they came to him and they said, how are you tractor pulling and your clutch lasts and we can't get ours to last in the field? And he goes, I don't know, I'm building my own. And they said, you got any for sale? And I think he sold them a couple, and then guess what happened? They owned it, and he couldn't
get the rights to it anymore.
Yeah, but he was selling Air Research turbos, which were, I think, newer at the time, and he had a really good setup. And the thing at the time was his pipe, because he had this feeling that coming off the big turbo into the little turbo, you had to have a way to stop that air, because he thought that it would also flow into the other turbo. You needed to come to a point where it would stop and straighten the air out, if that makes sense.
Yes, because they talk about the air tumbling. That happened, because even in race cars, they talk about all of that.
So he had this pipe in his head, and another guy built it, and it kind of came around, and then it kind of hit a flat spot and then went into the other turbo. And I know my dad was probably the only one that had that pipe. And maybe that's why his tractor ran better than the others, because a lot of guys had the same motor. Like my dad's motor, I know in '78 was the same motor that Ernie had and Marvin Houghton had, and they all came out of Midwest Crankshaft in Chicago. So, basically they were interchangeable, but that twin turbo setup he had ran so much better. And I don't know why. Yeah.
And he never did run the 12,000 pound class.
No, the 9 was enough, and then he quit running that because he couldn't keep the gears in the rear end.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that was one thing. I know some of them tried to run all three of them, and I think that was part of the challenge.
Well, I think Ernie ran 9, 12, and 15.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, 7, 9, and 12.
Something like that. Yeah. 3 classes for sure.
The last one was maybe an open class, but they did run 3.
Yep.
One of the things that always comes up when we hear Doug Hamm's name is safety. And in the eastern side of Iowa, Hawkeye Downs, which is now still a speedway. We've had motocross there, a lot of different things over the years. There's go-karts and legend cars race. But there was fairs held there.
Yep.
And they also always had, it was some of the bigger tractor pulls in the eastern side of Iowa. And I think 2 years prior, there was a fatality at that event, prior to what your dad's did.
Yep.
So my question to you is, and I guess we're going to get it straight right on
Sure.
camera, but I heard your dad was a bit of a showboat.
And
I don't know if that was the cause of that or not.
Well,
so we want the truth
I
here.
think what happened to him there is when he came out of the hole, everything was fine, and the front end was up just a little bit. And he always, it was hometown pole, so that was, you've heard where you're adding alcohol to the water injection.
Right.
He put in a little extra. And of course, he always ran road gear, but the front end was up just a little bit. Still narrow front, and at about 75 feet, it started dragging him left. Well, I think he was turning the wheel.
Okay.
And I don't think he realized. And it touched and straightened out a little bit, but then it kept going left, and then it touched the second time, rolled him over.
Okay.
And he was lucky to get off. I got a picture that was in the paper where he's on the ground getting up, but yeah, it was crazy.
And they would have had fenders at that time?
He had fenders because 2 years before Lester Hinson died because he didn't have fenders.
Yeah. The story I heard, the front end was up and he was showboating and spinning the wheel around.
No, he would have never done that because he wanted to
win. So you heard it straight from us right here today.
No, I think he literally, it was dragging him left, and in his mind, I don't.
He couldn't see the wheels.
I think the tire was only that high off the ground, and I think he thought that it was on the ground and it wasn't turning, and before he got on the brake, it was already too late.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. No, he would have never. I mean, he might have bragged a little bit or something, but he'd have never. No.
Well, I was just going to ask you that because I've heard, he liked to showboat a little bit. That's the story I heard. Maybe that was new to you.
No, it was new to me, but the thing I learned by watching some of this, like Fred Nichols interviews, I never knew as a kid how much my dad actually won until you start thinking about it. And he didn't win every pole, but he was the guy to beat.
Right, for a number of years.
When you hear other guys talk about it, I finally realize it now as an adult that he was kind of on a pedestal a little bit. Yep.
Right. And you don't think about it when you're in the middle of that. As a result of that, just for the audience that's listening that maybe doesn't know, I mean, basically a narrow front end is a trike front end, and it's just two wheels that are narrow. And he would not have been able to see those wheels technically from the seat.
Well, they had to have side shields at that time.
Right.
So you wouldn't have seen those wheels,
And so what happened as a result of your Doug's accident was they went with a wide front where the wheels set out and gave more stability if something like that happened.
And it was mandated, that fender rule made it all the way through the summer. And then a friend of mine, Troy Warskow, his dad is Ron Warskow, and he went to the meetings in Ohio or whatever, and there was a lot of guys that were really upset about having to put fenders on.
Right.
And they got it through. But Dad's deal, that week the NTPA came out and said, no more pull until you get a wide front end on there. And that's how it was. I mean, he got the tractor back home, started fixing it back up, got the wide front end, put it on, and then went back. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now we know.
Yep. Now
So
that's his. I mean, it's really his rule in a roundabout way. Yep.
I was sandbagging to ask that question because I was like, I want to find out if that was the case or not.
Yep.
And that was really, those were the beginnings of safety features.
Sure.
It was from Cedar Rapids, Iowa,
Yep.
NTPA, the National Series, and it was from Lester Hanson's
death
and then Doug's accident that really started it. And of course, today, if they watch anything, they're going to see roll cages.
Which was also created by the wide front end wasn't enough. Yeah.
So because it still happens. We still see people come up and turn the wheels and then something happens.
It'll still get on your side.
It'll still dump the tractor. So. Class distinction.
That was one thing I put on that list, and it's something that in the 70s that I really do miss, and it's not a knock to anything now, but you could tell by looking at a tractor what class it was in. It didn't make any difference. You could tell a 4430 wasn't going to probably pull the 7 in the 70s.
Right.
Or a D21 would have, but you could tell by looking at them kind of what they had and where they all belonged. It was a different time. Now I go to the pulls, and I can't honestly tell you what for sure class yours is, how yours is different than another one just by looking at it.
Right.
And that's kind of something I do miss from the past.
Right.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's very unique, just talking about a bit of history, I grew up in Kelowna.
Yep.
And so that was kind of the hometown pull, which Ernie was there and put on a good pull. But there was no scale, portable scale.
Right.
So they would scale at the local feed store. They would drive these tractors up and down the road back to where they were pulling them. And you would pull them on open trailers.
Sure.
So you're right. We seen them coming into town.
Yeah.
How
great was that?
If we didn't know the tractor or what class, we knew just by looking kind of where it was going to end up.
Sure.
So I still have family members that are like, why don't you pull that thing on an open
I
trailer?
know,
And
but
I'm like,
it was the greatest because when you're traveling in a pack, you could see them, or down the road you'd see one, or when you got to the pool you'd see them all. And a good friend of mine, Jeff Taylor, said that when he was a kid, his dad used to take him to the state fair. They'd sit over there where the tractors would come in, and they'd get to see every one of them because nobody had it, hardly anybody had it in a semi-trailer at that time or whatever you call it. And, there was a time they used to have to haul them on a grain truck.
Yes.
And back up to a dock. Think about that. You have to back up to a dock, unload it, drive it over to the feed mill, weigh it, drive it back. Yeah.
So there's a lot of difference in how things are done today.
Yep.
And that's built a lot of community around that piece of it. Want to talk a little bit about, there's something that's come up in a couple different podcasts, and the one that we've never came up that we've never talked about is the pace tracker.
Right, I wanted to talk about that.
And so I'd like for you to talk about that, and then of course the chain was something I think maybe has come up once or twice, but when your dad was back pulling that Oliver, that was probably the normal situation back then.
That pace tractor, I really think made it all the way to 74, and all that was your just like your speed speed limit class or whatever. The only problem with that is how could that tractor ever be the same speed? And you got a different tractor every time you go to a different event.
Right.
But the reason my dad put a Crowler clutch in, and he was one of the first ones to do it. He wasn't the first John Deere or first tractor, but he was like the second or third. John Bakowitz, Illinois, had one first, but he did that because that pace tractor, when they knew you were getting ready to go, they'd take off.
Right.
Well, he was starting to catch them, so he put that clutch in. Well, then he could slip it for about 75 feet. Well, now they're 200 feet out there. You're never going to catch them.
Right.
That was one of his first things.
And he could sandbag a little. And
he said they'd see the smoke come. Well, he's still sitting there holding it back, And so that's why he did that. And then boom, everybody had that clutch. But then the pace tractor finally did go away.
Right.
Yep.
And they let the speeds go where they were. And the chain, just for those listening, he pulled with that probably up.
And that's something I never saw. I just wrote it down. A friend of mine said, bring it up. And I know you talked about it.
Yeah.
Yep.
The first tractor pull I ever seen had that. And as I recall, they just take a vice grip and clamp it onto the frame rail. And I know it came up with a couple others too, that was just a safe. It was a safety thing, I think. They were trying to control it. And of course, eventually, what sells tickets is excitement.
Yeah.
And they got to start letting things go.
Yep.
And so some of those features went away. I almost believe I recall that some of the classes, they would have a faster speed though than they would on others. And I don't know if you
couldn't tell you.
that.
I couldn't tell you. I just know some of the promoters were getting tired of it. I remember the big pull in Davenport, Lanny Kai and Daryl Dorsher put that on, and they always said that they told all the pullers beforehand that we told that pace tractor driver, if anybody catches you tonight, you're not going to get paid. You know what I mean?
Right.
We want to put on a show. We don't want them to get disqualified because they went too fast.
Right.
Yeah.
So speed up and let
them go.
Let them go.
Yep.
Tow rigs. You talked a little bit about your dad's tow rig. Let's start with what he had at the beginning. When he
just a
first
pickup
started.
he started with a grain truck and then a pickup in a trailer.
But when he had that Oliver, he probably
drove it to most of them, and then I think he upgraded to a grain truck, took the sides off, hauled it that way. But the John Deere, I think he always had a trailer that he pulled behind a pickup, and it got to be where 99% of the guys had a pickup. A lot of them had Jerry Fornash and those guys had half-ton pickups.
Yeah.
And, a drive-on trailer, and that's all it was. And, it's funny what you seem to think you got to have now, but we got along. There's a picture in there where he's got his tractor on the trailer. He's got all the weights on there. When he goes up a class, there's a 5-gallon can with diesel in it that he wired to the chain, so it wouldn't fall off. And we didn't take much for tools, it didn't break that much. No. So it was just totally different deal.
Right.
And,
Well, I think, do you have any idea how far he would have driven that Oliver before, like for the furthest distance?
I wouldn't think very far. Not like, when you were talking to some of those guys that go, 80 miles or so. Yeah, no, I would think he stayed local, probably 30 miles. Yeah, at best. Yeah.
And at that point, just about every town,
sure,
whatever days they had, 4th of July, other events.
Yep.
Traveling. Talk about that a little bit. Some of the things that you guys did, because that was probably your vacation.
That's all we did in the summertime. There was, there was one year ITPA in the 70s had 53 different events. There were some on the same night in different sides of the state. If you think about how many tractors, and just, there'd be times, we'd stay pretty much on this side of the state, but he would get over in the western side. But all the time. I mean, you could pull Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Sometimes on the weekend, there'd be one at noon, and then you were done. You'd drive 30 miles, and there was another one.
Right.
One time me and my dad went to, we took off, went to Minnesota, and then we went all the way over to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Then we went back to Decorah. Then we went to like Hinton. Then we went to Winter. It was all like in 7 days.
And
We stayed in a motel. We didn't.
Really?
I mean, that's just what we did. And once in a while, we'd sleep in the pickup, and we just, that's what you did. And you really didn't. We did have to stop at the John Deere dealer on the way back through Decorah to fix something. I don't know what it broke. And they, those John Deere dealers love to see that come in there.
Right.
They wanted to work on it.
Right.
They'd send everybody on that thing, and yeah.
Yeah, I recall that as well, that it was not unusual for whatever brand that tractor to show up at an implement dealership.
They were in love, yeah.
Yeah, they would change oil, do whatever
Whatever
needed
you wanted,
to
yep.
happen. When you traveled, so the NTPA at that time had chapters.
Mm-hmm.
And the NTPA is still a national circuit and kind of the big circuit, is the big circuit in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's broken up into more smaller divisions and different circuits. But when you guys were doing that, if they were having pulls in different places the same night, you were running for points basically for ITPA.
Sure.
And then if you had a separate set of points, and some of those events were combined and some were not.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
I think anything after 73, 74 was all Iowa. And then there'd be, like Cedar Rapids, you'd have different classes of pulls. Like,
Right.
that might be what we would call now a regional national rather
Right.
than a grand. It might be a grand national, but it was a smaller purse.
Right.
Davenport was a grade A, big time
That was-
grand national pull.
Yep.
But he would stay over here if there was one over there. But you didn't have to be there because there was so many. That guy couldn't come over here either. See what I mean? You were still getting points.
Points off of where you're at. And then state fair was always a big deal.
Sure.
Pretty much for every state.
Sure.
Those were the national.
Well, and they
ones.
used to pull. I think they pulled 2 different days out there at one time, and he even talks about the state fair parade where in the early 70s where they wanted the tractor pullers to drive in that parade. I mean, that was just how much different things are,
Right.
Yeah.
Which today you'd never drive your tractor.
No, not downtown Des Moines, for 2 miles. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I know what I was going to say. The one thing I do recall being young and at a tractor pull in Kelowna, they moved the one class back because somebody was coming in and had called ahead. And they weren't getting there in time to make the class. And of course, they wanted a full field of pullers if they were on their way. So that was not uncommon for them to work together like that, promoters, and try to get that.
Well, he was always late at the pull. I mean, if it was 2 hours and the pull started at 7, we wouldn't leave till at least 5 something. And there were so many times we'd get there and I'd have to go sign him up and he'd be getting unloaded and his class might already started. Now you get dinged if you're 2 hours later than 2 hours or whatever. But that's just how he was. And I don't know. I mean,
that was kind of common with some of those others. I remember some others though rolling in just at the last minute.
Yep.
And they all knew it. They'd maybe push the start time back. And you're right. It's definitely
and
changed.
you couldn't call ahead. And
Yeah.
the thing people forget too is the roads. Everything was a 2-lane road. Very rarely were we on the interstate unless we were going to Des Moines and there was no 380 except we were up to Swisher. I mean, that was it. And the travel time has got to be half of what it is now.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you went through every little town there was. Talk about some of the friendships. I just visiting before we started this, I feel like I have missed a lot of that because I was involved in other forms of motorsports, but you've really been involved in tractor pulling your entire life. And what I'm starting to understand from doing this podcast is that a lot of these names have just hung out there for years and years and years. And I'm starting to recognize them because I keep hearing them. But talk about that a little bit because you really, as a child, started to develop friendships that you have to this day, and those folks are still out doing.
Oh yeah, and they were just always as a group. You'd leave a pull, and it wasn't uncommon for 20 of the tractors to be at a Pizza Hut or just sit.
Right.
I mean, you'd take the whole Pizza Hut over. You'd put all the tables together, and then all the guys would be grabbing the waitress's ass when she walked by. Just stupid stuff like that. But everybody was having a good time. And we just everybody was friends, and they all traveled together. If somebody broke down, they help you fix. Just stuff like that. And, when you're around that as a kid, they're kind of all like you're looking up to all these guys because they're, your heroes because they're pulling tractors. And I was lucky. I knew all those guys. I know when Mike Fornash was talking about his dad, I felt like I knew his dad like a dad because I was with him all summer long. We might not be at the pull for 2 hours together, but him and Dad always talked and joked, and
Right.
and they always spent time together as a group. The wives would all go sit together and watch the pull and write down distances, and that's not, doesn't mean they couldn't have been in the pits. That's just what they did, you know. And it just was a different. I think it was just different time.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's just, and it's awesome that happens because you've now developed friendships that you've got for life.
Yep.
Scattered around the state.
Yep.
You never know when
Yep.
you want to rely on those.
Yep.
You got in here that you want to talk a little bit about Ernie's cowboy hat.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody brought it up.
No.
But in the 70s, in the late 70s, Kenny Rogers was big, you know.
Yes.
And Ernie had the beard, and for some reason he had a cowboy hat. And he started wearing it, and he was wearing it when he was pulling. And then George Hendrickson would say, "Oh, you know, here comes Kenny Rogers," or whatever. And people would come up to him. I mean, he kind of looked like Kenny Rogers,
Right.
and people would come up to him in the pits and take a good look at him. And I just thought that was really neat as a kid because I don't know, you knew the guy and you knew he was joking around. And yeah, just that him wearing a cowboy hat, which you probably can't even picture that, but he did. And
Now I remember seeing photos of it
yep,
at least.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. No, that was really neat, and I just thought I'd bring that up because you hadn't really talked about anything like that. Yep.
And folks in this part of the country wore cowboy hats
Yep.
more back in that day. And I guess as a kid, the thing I remember mentioning his beard, and I would have to go back and look at an old centennial book for the town of Kelowna, but there was actually a beard growing contest.
Ah.
And that's what started Ernie even having a beard, because
Sure.
other than that, he never had
No,
one. So
no.
it was about a one-year deal that
yep,
he was trying to
yep,
grow this
yep.
beard out. And that's why he did it.
Yep.
Hawkeye Downs, we brought that up already. I know it was a very special place to your family because really it was almost a hometown
Sure.
pull for you.
Sure.
You're not that far away from there.
Yep.
So how many years did you guys go up there, and tell us some stories about that? We kind of covered the one. But...
I mean, he pulled there anytime there was a pull, and it got to be a really big pull in the late 70s, early 80s. In 81, his last year, it was a regional national, and he actually won that night. And there was big names there. I mean, Ken Brabeck was a Grand National champion in 78, and I can't think of his name out of Wisconsin, had the Deer Power special. Dave Schreier, he was in 1980. He was there. Dad beat all those guys. And that's the thing I wish that he would have done. Ken Brabeck told my dad, we were at a pull somewhere, and he's like, in 77, I'm going to run the Grand National next year, because his brothers had already been doing it with their 180. Dad's like, why would you want to do that? He's like, well, because my kids are older, and I'll get to see the country and all that.
Right.
And he won the points, and I really wish my dad would have done that. My mom always pushed him. He just didn't want to leave home. He didn't want to be that far from home.
Right,
and I'm kind of the same way. I like going to Rock Valley for 6 hours away, but I sure like getting home.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, that's it seemed like some of those guys traveled a ton when that
Yep.
happened, and then others just hit all the local stuff, and you kind of had it figured out there.
Yep.
But
no, he'd always go to Davenport. Was a big Grand National. He'd always be there. State Fair was always, you could have 30 in your class. He wouldn't miss those. He just wouldn't drive any farther to go.
Right,
Yeah.
Right. Well, I heard a lot of stories of guys from here driving into Missouri and Nebraska, and your dad never really.
Well,
did that
we went
much.
down to Bethany, and then Dad went to Farm Fest '76, which Fred Nichols won, and my dad got second that year. He went up there. He used to go to Spencer, but
Was that the beginning of the alcohol for Fred?
I think Fred was still diesel.
He
76.
was,
Yep.
Because he had a pretty strong. That's right. Because he had mentioned he had a strong run.
Yep.
And he ended up. He said I probably pulled the trigger moving a little too early.
Yep.
Because he was kind of at a peak with the diesel.
Yep. I think he probably could have gone a couple more years. Yeah. They just didn't have the technology that they do now. Yep.
So then, because it's setting back with a learning curve on that piece of it. But the big pulls, you talk about Bethany and Davenport again. That was just something. I mean, there were any stories out of those?
Well, the story that I wanted to share was being a kid. The only access you had to these other pullers from the East Coast would be a magazine. There wasn't a TV show or a podcast or a radio, whatever. And to be a kid and see those tractors like the Super Banana and Solid Junk, I got it written down there. And, I was there in 78. Solid Junk and Danny Dean, two big shooters. And both of them had got out the end. And that's the first time I saw Solid Junk in person. And it was Solid Junk. It was just junk. But the guy had sharp tires, and he knew what he was doing, and it ran hard, and they got to pull off. And that old Solid Junk Minneapolis, he blew by and pulled the throttle back, and the crowd just exploded. It was just, you had to be there, and I was.
Right.
And I know there's a lot of people that say, God, I wish I could have seen that. And I saw it, and it's all up here. But, you'd go there, and you'd see all those big names, the little American modified tractor everybody talked about. And R.R. Fonz was there, pitted right beside you. Just stuff that you never knew they really were even real till you got to see them. Yeah.
They were more a cartoon in the magazine.
They were, because you're still only 6-7 years old, and you idolize these guys because they got cool tractors.
Right. Yeah. No, that's just, times have definitely changed with technology we have, which is fine. Hot rods is something that I want to ask you about because you ended up with the truck.
Yep.
And of course, farm kid and your dad had a tractor. Sometimes they make that switch and sometimes they don't. It seemed like a lot of the farm guys did have tractors. But the hot rods also, I mean, we've had other guests that have talked about that. What are some of your memories and stories on that?
Well, I like how they called them hot rods instead of modifieds. I always liked that. I always kind of liked them when I was a kid. I liked the noise. And Dad always seemed to hang with a lot of those guys, too, when we traveled, like Vern Huser and Bobby Gooden and some of those guys. And I just thought it was neat. And I liked the noise and the fact that every one of them was different, Right. If I go to a pull, I'm going to watch the super stocks because I love the smoke. And I'm going to watch the mods. But I also like the truck. And I think the reason we got into the trucks in the early 90s is because of the cost. It was easy to start small. And then, of course, you know how that goes. But and it was different. And, my dad, I said to my dad, do you want to build a tractor? He's like, no, let's do something different. I already did that. Let's build a truck. Right. And it all started right over here at North Liberty. It was local. So,
And that's kind of I call you a purist because you love tractor pulling in general, and that's kind of what we see. I've seen others that, some of them will stick with a truck, a modified, but then you guys have just kind of went across
I like it all.
Gamut.
Yeah, so. I told you earlier, if I was going to build one, I'd build one of those light limit supers. Yeah.
I think the thing that's changed for me now that I'm pulling, I've gained respect for those others. I just always liked black smoke.
Sure.
But once you see the work and what they put into it, everybody deserves a seat at the
there's
table.
nothing like the smell of that ether when you're warming that tractor up. I don't care what anybody says. We had a thing happen at the Iowa Tractor Puller Banquet a couple years ago, and I know we made some people mad, but they were giving out cans of ether as a door prize, and I was sitting with the worst cows, and I said, "Give me that. I just want to." It was John Deere ether, and that's good smelling stuff. So I shot it up in the air.
Well, that's what most people are using.
Guess what? Yeah, but guess what happened after that? Then it's getting shot up in the air, and
pretty soon
people were pissed off, and I quit shooting it, but not everybody else did. But there's nothing. And when he went to the twin turbos, they had to decompress those motors so much. It would take like 25 minutes to warm that stupid thing up. I was a little kid. It'd take 2 cans of ether in my pocket and one in my hand just to get it to maybe run. And then it'd get out online and die, and I have to run out there and get it. It just didn't run. And I just love the smell of black smoke. I'll never not love black smoke. Yeah.
Well, that's I always wish they would make a clone that had 2-stroke. Like, I'd love standing behind a starting line of a 2-stroke motorcycle. Of course, those are all 4 strokes
and
now.
then some of that racing feel you smell in some of those trucks.
Well,
smells
that's
good.
what we would run that in the motorcycles, and you got that smell. It's just
it was always
amazing.
good. Yep.
But you got a couple names written down here: Headley, Goodwin, Bobby, Husser.
I got Vern Huser, Bobby Gooden, Ron Headley, Jerry Fornash, Bob Chickering. Those are names that always stuck out. I really liked Bob Chickering's tractor when he was running it was that Ford motor, that Cammer motor.
Yep.
And
what was the name of that tractor?
Inch Pincher.
That's right.
Yep. And he had a cool paint scheme on it, mag wheels before anybody else. That motor really, he won, even when he went to the Allison, he won a lot of pulls, but he was just super sharp.
Right.
And I just loved back with the narrow front, and I don't know, he had pinstriping and all this stuff, and yeah.
Do you know what he started with on that tractor?
I think it was probably like an F20. Yeah. He was one of the first guys. Him and Jerry
Fornash. A lot
Fornash.
of them did the F20 and then Montgomery Wards. Those were kind of the two that people used a lot on that.
Yep, and just names that, like I said, we used to pit with Vern Huser, who still pulls. I got to visit with him at the ITPA banquet this year. And he's 74, 75. He's running a mod again. He seems the same as he did in 1975, and he's just a good guy. Likes to win, and
The Goodwin.
No, this is Bobby Gooden. It's bad.
Gooden. Okay.
Yeah, he had a mod tractor, and he was one of those guys that had tough luck. Like one night he broke the motor, or broke the tranny, which broke the motor, and then the next night it broke him again. He was always doing that stuff. Him and Vern Huser picked up a blower motor somewhere, and they stopped in Iowa City to have a beer in a bar. Well, then those two like to get in a bar and get drunk and fight. Right. So they got in a fight in there, and they called Chris Fountain and said, "You got to go down there and get that blower motor out of there. It's going to sit there all night in that truck." Just stuff like that. These guys were fun guys. Right. They just like to have a good time. Yep.
Well, and Chris Fountain was another one who had a hot rod back in the day, or a modified today.
Yep.
So, and he built a lot of transmissions for those guys. So.
Yep.
Headley was another one. I think he ran Hemis.
He was a Hemi guy.
And, of course, son-in-law to
Jerry,
and
Yep.
had Betty's headache. So we
Yep.
always liked, I remember at some of the pools that I would attend, they were there. It was always, it seemed like, oh gosh, I can't say his name now, Chickering, and
Yep.
then Fornash, Headley.
Yep.
Those three were about always there.
Yep.
Wayne Longnecker was
Yep.
another one.
He's still pulling.
And
Yep.
Emil Murda
Yep.
was another one
Yep.
that was there a lot. So those were a lot of them in this area
Yep.
too that
Yep.
we added in on that.
There was a lot of pullers in this side of the state
Yeah.
that there isn't anymore.
Right.
So, yeah.
And that kind of went, I feel like the farm crisis of the 80s weeded a lot of
clipped
that
them.
out.
Yeah.
It took a lot of them out. And now the sport's built back, and I'm curious what you see, but, back then, probably the majority of them were farmers. Today, it's
Not so
completely
much.
reversed.
Yeah,
Almost.
not so
It's,
much.
some may farm, but they
Yep.
usually have some other business that they're involved in.
Yep.
John Deere shirts. What's the story behind those?
Well, I would like to. My dad used to wear a shirt that it was you would wear it at the John Deere dealership, like the parts guys would wear.
Right.
It would say Schwitter's Incorporated on the back, and then they had some with his name, and he always wore that yellow shirt. And if anybody watches this and they got one, I'd love to have one.
Okay.
But it was just that was his thing, and he always wore a black John Deere hat. Just kind of his
kind
thing.
of his uniform that he had.
Yep.
Okay. Solid Junk and Danny
We
Dean.
talked about that.
And you
Yep.
talked about that
Yep.
one. Okay.
But quickly, I'd like to say I think some of the thing that killed pulling was Hypermax and Jerry Legade because of the cost. I mean, I don't know if anybody knows what some of that stuff cost in the 70s, but like Danny Dean would be number one on the list, and then maybe another guy and another guy, and
Right.
you would spend thousands of dollars to get that kit.
Well, and I think what has happened that has probably leveled the playing field today and made it more competitive. John Klug was a part of that, and
Yep.
I think Danny Dean kind of came in as Klug phased out.
Yep.
But they were the Hypermax poster
They were-
child,
yeah.
and International got behind it.
Yep.
Secretively, kind of. But
Well, Jerry Legade was an engineer in International, and that
Right.
last engine that he built, guess what? It was built for all his high performance stuff would work
Right.
and live.
Right.
So that modern block, whatever it was, but that last one is all his.
yeah.
I mean, he kind of had the world by the,
Yeah, he had it, and that made it really difficult for a lot of the John Deere guys or
Yep.
any other manufacturer for
Yep.
a period of time.
Yep. Yeah, when they came with first they called it Silver Shield, where they covered the engine.
Yep.
Then they had left-hand power, which was, you knew it had 3 turbos. And then they would start coming with the 4 turbos and all his fuel stuff and all that stuff.
Right.
And when he could put it together in a package, they were tough to beat.
Right,
But
yeah.
it cost those guys, I think it cost them some farms. I do. And
No, I agree.
And I think that might have hurt because to be at that top of that list, you might not have been able to swing it.
Right.
And yeah.
Well, and you always heard of stories of maybe just farm economy and some things like that.
Yeah.
But they spent a lot of money on
Well,
that.
yeah, you had bad farming economy,
Then
and you're
you-
blowing $50,000 a year on a
And
yeah.
back then, that'd
in the
be
80s,
equivalent of a couple hundred today.
yeah.
Your dad's slogan.
Oh, he always said, nobody asked who got second, and he said it always, and I get his point, and it's true. I mean, if you're going to go out there, you want to win, and he got his fair share of win. He did way better than me. I won quite a few pulls when we were aspirated, but getting in the NTPA stuff, it was harder.
Right.
I always felt like I was competitive, but to have that edge now, it's a lot different than it was then. And he was just, the one thing about him is that he could read a track better than anybody.
Right.
When we would go, he would do that. That was his job, and I always
Right.
felt confident because he could just see it. I never could do. I mean, I could, but not like that.
Yeah.
But he always said, nobody asked who got second. And he'd just tell you that.
So he was the original Ricky Bobby.
Kind of like that. Yeah, kind of like
You're
that.
not first, you're last.
Yep.
Your sharp tires, that's something that I'm sure your dad's seen coming in, where
Yep.
they went from the farm lug
Yep.
to starting to cut tires.
Yep.
What are some of your memories on that?
Well, and the reason I put that down there is because he wouldn't go if they weren't sharp.
Okay.
And so the last set of tires he had were BF Goodrich, which I think was a really good set for that time. But they had the better, like more of a 23-degree
Right.
bar. And he bought this set somewhere, and he tells this story. And I don't know what was on the tires, but I'm going to tell you what he said. He bought them over in Illinois, picked them up at night, and then there was a dew. He said there was a white line around the outside and across the lugs, and he thinks somebody put acid or something on them to make them hard. But when he would grind those, it was never gooey. I mean, they were hard as a rock. And he also learned that the shorter they got, the better they worked.
Right.
And now in 81, he still had it somewhat of a lug, but he wasn't,
Right.
But he was clear down to, not
Right.
double cut yet because that hadn't come yet. But
Right.
yeah, but he would tell, and even with this, he'd say, we got to get them sharp. You're not going to, if you
Right.
don't have sharp tires, you're just giving up a little bit.
Right.
And he's right.
No, he's 100%
Yep.
right. It's a big deal today. And that's why I think quality of tracks today is a big deal too. You don't want to see any rocks or anything.
No,
They'll tear out
'cause
a set of
boy.
tires in a hurry.
Yeah.
Experienced that last year.
Yeah.
The ITPA Hall of Fame. I
Yep.
guess I'm curious to know if your dad's not in that?
No, and this is a sore spot, but I'm going to bring it up.
Yep.
They don't induct anybody who's passed. And I
Really?
tried. And I tried. George Henderson's not in it either. And I'm not trying to be an ass when I say this, but I think that's ridiculous.
Well, that's usually, if nothing else,
Well,
most Hall of
Walter
Fames.
Payton went in. And he was already passed. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I'm just talking. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
And now you're getting down to people that nobody knows, and I don't care who's in there. 20 years ago, they had plenty of guys to pick from, but look what you're going through.
Right.
You can't find anybody to talk because they've all passed away.
Right.
Why can't he be in there?
Well-
And there's other guys. I can name off a bunch of them that aren't in there.
That's because we're also in that vacuum of what we talked about, where when the 80s, because I remember thinking, is this sport going to die in this period
Especially
of time?
ITPA. It was
Right.
really small.
And so
yeah.
it's now, I think it's back as strong as it ever has
Yep.
been, and it's well organized, but you've got that gap. They don't have that pool to draw from.
Right.
And that's
Right.
interesting. I did not know that they don't
No.
that they don't do that
Nope.
because typically most Hall of Fames do.
Yep.
And I guess I mean, unfortunately, the ITPA kind of ended up mixed in with Outlaws. Am I
The
correct on
Outlaw,
that?
they joined Outlaw.
Yeah.
That was back when NTPA was telling you to put on roll cages. They didn't want to do
Right.
it. Then there was Out East ATPA, if you remember that. And then, so Iowa Tractor Pullers was NTPA. Now they're affiliated with Outlaw. If you want to be a member of ITPA type group for NTPA, it's called United Pullers of Iowa, which is a really small deal.
Right.
There's hardly any NTPA pulls in Iowa now.
Right.
And it's ECI, and
Right.
because they're so big and they put on a good show, and it doesn't cost as much. And that's
Right.
not a knock to ECI.
Right.
They've taken over this. Well, look at all the polls you go to.
Right.
So yeah,
Within 3 hours, we can
be
pull
about
as much
anywhere.
as
Yeah,
we want,
and it's still ECI.
And you go to the
Yeah,
western side of the state, you got the Outlaws doing
Yep.
the same thing.
Same
so
thing, yep.
It's a good organizations on both sides
Yep.
now. Pullers left from the 70s. I know we've kind of talked about some of that already. What do you want to add about that?
just the ones that I know of, like Ron Morskow is still out
Yes.
there. Fred Nichols, you talked to.
Yes.
I know Ken Braybeck passed, but I think his brothers are still around. You got Vern Huser and Wayne Longnecker who are still actually pulling,
Right.
which I think is really cool.
That is cool.
It's just a small, Mike Fornash was selling some videos, and I told him 10 or 15 years ago, gosh, we really should get some kind of reunion. Well, it never happened, and it's nobody's
Right.
fault. But it's too bad because most of them are still alive 10 years ago.
Right.
And there was a guy, Dad was, I can't think of it. There was about 5 guys that pulled from down around Mount Pleasant. That's where my dad ended up before he died, living down there.
Yep.
He was doing chemo with Jerry Mabius, I think was his name.
Okay,
from,
yes, his
from down
name's
there.
come
Yeah.
up.
And, they're gone. He's gone. And it's just,
Who was out of West Liberty?
Jack Simon
Jack
is
Simon,
gone. Yep.
and they lost.
Yep.
We lost him too.
Yep.
There was just it's a whole era of that group, and there's just not a lot of them
No,
left. And
no.
they're
That's why
really
this
the
is great that you're doing
they're
this. It
just,
really is.
well, thank you. But that was really the foundation of it, and built all the excitement around it. The
Yep.
truck pulling thing. Of course, originally they had the hot rods and the tractors,
Yep.
and then I would say it was probably late '70s, early '80s when the trucks started.
Sure.
And is that when you started getting
We
into
didn't.
it?
Dad, he was done in '81, and then we were all in our growing years, so we were in 4-H, showed cattle, did stuff like that, and then '91, I got a wild hair to build a truck, and he wanted to help if he said
Right.
I'd love to help if you want to do it.
Right.
So that's where we started, and at that time, sure, NTPA had trucks, but this was local stuff that was at the baby,
Right.
So we went through that whole phase, and it was fun because there was a lot of, just like he kind of went through, you had North Liberty and Oxford and Riverside and all these local pulls, the county
Right.
fair. That's where we got in, and here it was 30 years ago,
Right.
30 years ago, and that's when we started. But it just kept building into something
Right,
else because
right.
everybody wants to go faster. And,
Right,
yeah.
right. Well, and that's one thing I do like about that. It's still probably about as grassroots as you can get. You can
Yep.
take a 4-wheel drive truck and
Sure.
you really don't need to do much.
Not a ton, no.
You can hook to it and go have some fun in the summer.
Yep.
And the tractors have started to evolve, even the speed limit
Yep.
tractors.
There's a lot of them out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of them there. They put on a good show, and they're.
Yep.
But
Yep.
gosh, you're not going to take one off the farm
No,
anymore and go
nope,
compete
nope,
with them. There's
nope.
just no way.
Nope.
think about some of the crazy stuff that happened. Do you have a story or two that people pulling jokes on each other or anything like that?
I don't know. Those guys were always joking around about something.
Yeah.
You know, the funniest, it's not funny, but it's funny. At the state fair in the 70s, they'd pull in the afternoon, then they'd pull at night. Well, they'd all go over to Master Jack's and drink beer all afternoon, and they still pull at night, which I realize is not safe, but they did that. And there's a story where...
They also didn't wear helmets.
I know.
There.
They didn't wear helmets. They didn't have the seatbelts. They didn't have nothing. And another quick story about that is when I was a kid, the thing I always thought was interesting is you could always tell who pulled because they had dirt on the back of their shirt. You know, the one that had already pulled for the day. But anyway, there's a story where Ron Headley, he'd won in the afternoon. He bought a whole roll of beer tickets, put them in his hat, and he'd pull one out and hand you one. They just sat in there all afternoon, drank beer, had fun. That's probably not cool, but they were having fun. You know, I mean, they just...
Simpler times
That's
back
what they
then.
did. You know, I mean, they just did. And just, you know, they'd go to the fair and hang out. They'd go do stuff. They just, I don't know. There's so many stories. I guess I didn't really try to think about funny stories. It just...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we have people that ask about that. What happened to your dad's tractor when he quit?
So in 1980, he was working over here at the Alice Chalmers dealership. It was called Nemechek's.
Yep.
And the owner wanted to build a 4-turbo D21. That's what he wanted to do. And Dad said, I would sell mine and drive it if that's what you want to do. And he's like, okay, we'll build one. So he sold his tractor to a guy named Terry Eister Repair. Yep. And he bought it, and he worked there too. And spring of 81 comes around.
That's where that thing went?
Yeah, well, he bought it. And spring of 81 come around, and all of a sudden, no tractor. So here's Terry with Dad's tractor. Dad said, do you want me to help you? And he said, well, yeah, because I don't even know if I can drive it. You know, so Dad started driving it. Next thing you know, he's driving all the time because Terry's not, you know, they're winning and making prize money and whatever.
So
why screw it up, you know? So that was one of my dad's favorite years because he didn't work on it. He told them how to grind tires and do all that stuff. And
didn't spend any money.
No, and all we did was we still hauled it on our truck and trailer, and we all went to the polls and whatever. And he chased the points that year. And the greatest story about that is he had to go to Hinton, Iowa to stay in the points race to win. And he was already done farming and working over here. And the only way we get there, we hired a small plane to take us from Iowa City to Hinton, dropped us off. Those guys picked us up and we went to the pole, and he won, got in a pull off with Edson Lane, beat him, came home, and went to school the next day or whatever. Well, it would have been, I was in summertime, but yeah, that was really cool.
There's a name I haven't heard in a while.
Yeah, Edson Lane. Yep.
Yeah.
And he was really good in the 70s. He was really coming around. So then that tractor, Terry sold it. I think he kept it about a year, but then he sold it, and Marv Hobden bought it. And I think Marv Hobden ran parts of it and his own. He had 2 for a while. But it just ended up, all the parts just got used up. And I got the side shields in there. I think the original frame rail's out there somewhere. I don't know.
Right.
But no, there's no engine parts or turbos or anything like that.
You don't realize how special that stuff is till it's gone, because at the time you think you can just get it again.
Yeah.
But you
can't.
30, 40 years later, you're sitting there going, gosh.
Well, those side shields I had to get, I found out Marv Hobden still had them in the barn. And before my dad passed, I went up and got them. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And his son Dave, who I knew from a kid, saw me at a pole one night, and he's like, hey, we still got those. And I called up there and went and got them. And I was just happy to have them, you know.
Well, I find through doing these, I have people reach out to me, and I've got to stay secretive about it because I need people's trust. But I'm finding out where there are parts that people have, and they're not telling anybody because they don't want family members upset. But they acquired it through... I mean, it was nothing nefarious. It was just they'd acquired here and there because nobody cared.
Right.
Yeah, take it.
Right.
And now family members are like, well, we'd like to have it.
Yeah.
Well, too bad you don't have it. So.
Well, you got some side shields that,
that's
what I'm saying.
They gave it away, and I know
his
his family's sitting there going, I had somebody even contact me about that. It's going, oh, how'd you get that?
Yeah, I know where.
He just gave it to me.
I know where John Klug's side shields are, and I will never tell you.
Yeah, well, I do too.
But do you? And then isn't that funny how he got a hold of them, and you would never think that.
No.
But that's where they're at. Yeah.
But it's nobody cared till now.
Now, and think what they might be valuable to somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
So. That Alice Chalmers ever get built?
Never got built.
Never did.
Nope.
So,
never got built.
And then after that year, did he keep driving the tractor? That was kind of the final 82.
He drove it. 81 was the last year, and that's when he won the points again with that tractor. And then they were done because they didn't want to continue. Terry, I don't think, wanted to continue to do it, and that's fine.
Right.
And that's when we just kind of got away from it. So there's a 10-year span in there where there's pullers like Larry Sanders that I don't even know because I wasn't going from 82 to 91.
And that was about the period that Sanders drove and ran different.
Now I knew the tractor, but when Steve Graham had it, I knew it when I was a kid.
Oh,
but
really?
I didn't know it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I've run across photos in some of the old NTPA and ITPA magazines when Steve had it. And ran it.
Sure.
And then,
it ran hard.
Yeah, it did.
Yep.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Breaking Barriers podcast. We appreciate your time listening to this. If you guys have anything that you would like to add or comments to make, please drop those in the comments section. If you have guests or other people that you think we should interview, please give us that information as well. The part that seems difficult is to get the phone numbers and who to contact, and we just appreciate all the listeners helping us with that so much. It makes my job a lot easier. And we appreciate you watching this episode of Breaking Barriers.
Breaking Barriers.